Interregional transmission, and I would like to introduce the chair of the panel, Professor Joshua Macey from the law school at Yale. So, Josh.
All right. I understand that my role is primarily ministerial here, so I'm just going to provide a very brief introduction, speak for maybe 15 seconds about some things I think about, and then take the chairman's prerogative to reserve the first question, and then we'll be off to the races. I'm delighted to introduce Brian Sergi from NREL, John Moura from NERC, Derek Stenclik, apologies if I'm pronouncing anyone's name incorrectly, from Telos Energy, and Kris Zadlo. They're going to talk to us about interregional transmission planning. My understanding is the presentations are going to tell us about many of the benefits and challenges of this, and I'm hoping sort of some of the things I've been ruminating over in the last year are how do we design resource adequacy markets when capacity resources are accredited primarily in one RTO, when planning is done primarily from the bottom up, even when we have all of these studies showing the enormous value, how do you calibrate utility financial incentives so that they pursue socially valuable projects? And when we calculate the benefit to cost ratio of interregional transfer capacity, how do we assume well-functioning resource adequacy markets, or do we assume the kind of parochial and siloed processes we have? But with that, let's take it, Brian.
Okay, can everyone hear me? I'm Brian Sergi. I'm at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, and specifically in the Grid Planning Analysis Center. And I'm going to talk a little bit about transmission's role in resource adequacy. You can kind of think of this as like a framework for how we might evaluate the value of interregional transmission, but also kind of transmission more generally, which is one of the reasons it kind of moved me first, is it'll be a sort of higher level maybe than some of the more specific applications. So if you're looking for me to present, here's how much interregional transmission is worth in a specific case, I'm sorry, it might disappoint you, but hopefully it will be a useful kind of paradigm to think about. Oops. Okay. So I want to start with just thinking about kind of resource adequacy as one of the many potential benefit streams of transmission. This is a kind of summary from a report that some of my colleagues released earlier this year, talking about different areas for transmission, interregional transmission, where we can find value. And I think, from the resource adequacy side, a lot of us think about these bottom two rows. You think about maybe reliability, and, to evaluate that, you might take a specific build out, remove a transmission line, look at the impact on loss of load expectation or whatever your resource adequacy metrics are. And that's how you assess the value of that transmission line. And those studies are super valuable, and we do those all the time at NREL, but I kind of want to make a case for considering some other parts of this resource, or some other benefit streams for this resource adequacy analysis, which is thinking about kind of the avoided cost side. So transmission can help you avoid having to build new generation. It can help you, access more favorable resources that cost less to operate your system. That can make you more resource adequate at a lower cost, and that inherently brings value as well. So, to capture that benefit stream, it's a bit harder because you need to kind of understand how this integrated planning question is answered. If you're building transmission, how that is affecting your generation requirements. You also sort of need to kind of have this linkage then between your, capacity expansion or your portfolio planning tools and what the resource adequacy implications are. And we have seen this in a couple of sessions, that the computational challenges of both sides of those equations can be really challenging, and so that makes this a difficult problem. Transmission contribution to reliability is not just about the reliability itself, but it's also about cost. And this is a point I think don't have to emphasize too much to this group, because this group has issued the kind of working paper on this that demonstrates that we need to be thinking about the trade-off between what you're willing to pay and the reliability that you're getting, and transmission kind of should be considered in that paradigm. And so I want to point to a kind of framework for approaching this, which is sort of along the line of a Pareto frontier. This is some work, again, that colleagues of mine at NREL have done, kind of illustrating the way we might think about this trade-off between system cost and shortfall risk, right? So you might say to yourself, we have a target for system reliability. We're unwilling to go below that target because we'd be at an unacceptable level of reliability. But after that point, we can build out more, we can be more reliable, but that is going to come at increasing costs. And often that increasing cost is nonlinear, and so it gets higher and higher more quickly. And so we want to be somewhere on that curve, or we want to figure out the right point on that curve that we're sort of willing to accept the trade-off. And so, this just changes a little bit how we consider the metrics for interregional or transmission in general, rather than just thinking about shortfall risk and our metrics for outages. We're also then thinking about, what is the cost to meet our target? And so that's coming in terms of, dollars of capital investment and things like that. So I want to talk about a framework that we've been used to kind of explore this problem, and this is, linking capacity expansion modeling to really examine this cost reliability trade-off in transmission. So approach we've been thinking about here is, you take a capacity expansion model and you have a reliability target, and so you're going to build that target, or you're going to build a system that meets that target. When you do that, you need to have some linkage with a resource adequacy tool to tell you, did you get to your target? Because usually the capacity expansion model is using a heuristic or a soft linkage to your RA evaluation metrics. So you're going to use your resource adequacy tool, assess your shortfall risk, and then you can plot it. So you've got, here's where this particular build out landed. Now you can go back and sort of repeat this process, but you can establish it for different reliability levels. So I'm going to change my planning reserve margin and see what I get. And I get another point. Maybe this is a system with a higher PRM, but now it's going to cost more. And it's going to have higher reliability. And you can do this again. You get another point. You get the idea. You're building out this curve, this Pareto frontier of what is possible in terms of cost and reliability. But now we can take that whole process, sort of put it in a box and say, let's rerun it, but for different transmission outcomes. Let's look at what is feasible in terms of different transmission buildouts. Maybe we have more restricted transmission siting cases, or we restrict the ability to build interregional transmission. And when we do that, we're going from this base case to now this other Pareto frontier. So this is a world maybe we can't build as much transmission. We've now shifted this curve upwards in some way where we have a different kind of curve trade-off scenario between cost and reliability. So that's kind of the high level framework that we're thinking about here. Okay, so we want to kind of, we took this framework and applied it specifically to some of our modeling tools that we use at NREL. This is particularly the REEDS capacity expansion model that we're building from here. And so what we do is kind of take REEDS, which solves your capacity expansion problem for different steps. An input to that is sort of what your initial kind of reliability target is. In this case, a kind of planning reserve margin that you want to satisfy, typically on the order to 12 to 18% above your peak load. And you've got your system design that comes out of REEDS. You evaluate it against your kind of our resource adequacy analysis. Here is just a capacity credit calculation that then feeds into the next stall year. So we take firm capacity contribution from the resources you build out, as well as information as what the marginal contribution for future resources would be. And that kind of goes into the next solve year and so on and so forth. So this is kind of the linkage that we have in kind of our base REEDS model for building out a system and then evaluating its performance. And then once we do that, we can kind of take the final build out and do a kind of more detailed resource adequacy analysis on it using a different set of tools. This is a resource adequacy tool called PRAS that has also been developed at NREL. Advantage of this over REEDS is it has ability to conduct probabilistic analysis with many kind of draws from different outage probability failure rates. And so you're capturing some of the correlated risks that you don't capture in the capacity expansion model. So from that model, we can kind of then get metrics like expected unserved energy. And in this case, I'll show normalized expected unserved energy for the system build out. Okay, and then in terms of scenarios, we tried a couple of different things. On the transmission front, we sort of just had this range of what you were allowed to build. We have sort of a base case where we just allow everything. This is the map in the gray lines basically shows the regional representation that we use in the REEDS model. So you have transmission between those regions. So in the new transmission, you can build between any of them. We have a no new interregional case where we don't allow any new transmission between the colored regions on this map. And then we have a really extreme case is just no new transmission at all. And we also study the kind of impact of the different transmission scenarios on these Pareto frontiers under different emission scenarios. So looking at a kind of business as usual case, but then also a zero carbon case where we're trying to achieve a zero emissions target for the system. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about some results from this framework and modeling approach. This is just one of these curves then shown for, this is a build out in 2050 from this Reed's world. This is for the continental United States. The y-axis is showing the annual system costs. And each point is showing one of these model runs where we set a different planning reserve margin. Then the x-axis is showing the actual normalized expected unserved energy on a basis of load. So you're seeing this kind of trade-off. The higher the planning reserve margin, the lower you get the expected unserved energy, but the more your system costs. And that's kind of what we would expect from this. So a few things to just highlight here. I mean, one is the ideal point is obviously a system that costs nothing and also has perfect reliability, but we can't get there. This curve is kind of preventing us because of the constraints of the system. 15% planning reserve margin is maybe one I've often thought of as kind of like a baseline level. You can see here that at that system, you've got a annualized system cost 265 million, but or billion, excuse me. But maybe more importantly, a normalized expected unserved energy of 38 parts per million. This kind of suggests that 15% is missing some things in the model. That planning reserve margin is not capturing some of the outages that we're seeing in a probabilistic resource adequacy model. And so maybe that's not getting you far enough along if your goal is to get to a lower expected unserved energy than that. Now here's the case with the no new transmission, and you can see basically, as in the kind of previous example, this is shifting the curve upwards and right. So you're getting kind of this, you're getting further away from the ideal point in terms of your trade-off. You could sort of see it shifts maybe up more on the right side. So like in the cases where you're allowing a lot of expected unserved energy, the difference in cost is quite bigger. In the cases with low expected unserved energy, it already costs a lot, so maybe it's not shifting as much. You can kind of slice this a couple of different ways, right? You could look horizontally, find systems that are the same cost, but have different reliability. Or if you look vertically, you have the same reliability, but different costs. And so that is, one way to kind of evaluate transmission's impact in this scenario, or at least the availability to build new transmission. You can also look at a specific point. So here I take the 15% planning reserve margin run again. And what's interesting about this one is the same kind of PRM put into the model. If you don't allow any new transmission, it is worse on both metrics, right? So you're getting worse reliability and the system costs more for that same planning reserve margin. So you could normalize one of those. You could just move up in cost and don't change reliability, or vice versa. But if you're just using that heuristic of a planning reserve margin, you end up on a worse score on both of those. Okay, so that was all in the business as usual emissions framework, but now I want to expand to this emissions or the zero emissions case. And I've also added in the kind of new or no new interregional transmission scenario. And just a couple of things to highlight here. I mean, one way to look at this is to pick a point on one of these lines and then see how it changes across the transmission restricted cases. I picked 2 points. This starting with, again, the planning reserve margin of 15%, but then just moving horizontally, same cost, but different reliability. And what we see here is that the impact on the system with the deep decarbonization target is much higher when you don't have the ability to build new transmission. So that's suggesting, taking away that option, not having transmission, is really changing that cost reliability trade-off a lot more severely when you have pretty big ambitions for emissions reductions in the power sector. We could zoom in a little bit. I know that probably for the system planners, seeing a range of 100 ppm on normalized expected unserved energies is pretty scary, and probably not one that most system operators would ever think about operating at. So if you look a little bit closer in, it may be like a more reasonable range, 20 ppm and below. You can kind of see some of the trade-offs between these curves. I mean, one interesting case is in the business as usual, this no new transmission case. Really, no matter how much you jack up the PRM, you aren't able to get to the same levels of reliability as the other scenarios. And that's in part because of the trade-off between transmission enabling new wind and solar and the inability of the Reed's model, at least, to kind of capture some of the correlated outages that the probabilistic resource adequacy model is capturing, in particularly for gas outages. So if you aren't capturing those in your model, the model can't build to it. And then, if you look up here, you can basically kind of see it, even high levels of reliability, at the decarbonization, under the deep decarbonization cases, you're getting, about a $10 billion annually difference in how much that system would cost when you are taking away the option to build new transmission. For context in that, it's $180 billion annually, I think, estimated for capital expenditures for all investor-owned utilities, and 20 to 25 annually in transmission expenditures. So this feels like a fair amount of money, relative to what the system has to build out, and again, just suggestive of the importance of transmission for this cost reliability equation. And then another thing to look at is basically what's the impact on new builds and generation. So here I'm showing the total change in capacity compared to the no new transmission case. In the left is the business as usual, on the right is the zero carbon. And you basically can see avoided generation capacity if you have new transmission builds enabled, right? So the more you're able to build transmission, you can share resources. In the BAU, that helps displace some mix of resources with the ability to build a little bit more CTs as peakers. But in the zero carbon world, that results in that completely being able to offset gas CCS in favor of combined cycle that's utilized a little bit more effectively and enabling more wind. And overall, we're seeing a reduction in 25 to 50 gigawatts of capacity. So that's consequential impact as well. So just to close out, this is sort of an ongoing effort. I think we have a lot more work in the space that we're interested in doing. We'd really like to explore this trade-off estimation approach with a wider suite of scenarios. What happens if there's more demand growth because of electrification? How does this change in different weather years? What's the interaction of transmission and kind of wind siting availability and deployment opportunities? Also doing some more of kind of, I alluded to earlier, but just doing kind of RA focused work where you look at a specific transmission corridor and maybe remove it and look at the impact on resource adequacy, but doing that for some of these future build out systems. And then lastly, kind of improving coupling between capacity expansion and resource adequacy tools. I'll talk about this just in a second, but we have more work in that space. But that said, we're really interested in kind of suggestions from folks on where this research stream should go. And then just to close out, to touch on that last piece, the approach I presented today is kind of using traditional Reed's formulation, which involved solving the capacity expansion problem and then calculating capacity credits for those solves and kind of moving forward in time. But that has some limitations, particularly for assessing the value of interregional transmission. And so we've kind of been working on this new approach where we directly integrate the probabilistic resource adequacy tool and have kind of feedback where we generate new periods to model directly and try to capture some of that outage representation. So just to kind of where we think we're headed, and something that we probably would like to continue to explore the impacts, particularly with the context of interregional transmission. So with that, thank you very much for your time, and certainly happy to take questions throughout the session.
All right. Hi, everybody. I'm John Moura. I'm the Director of Reliability Assessment at NERC, and I'm going to talk a little bit about our interregional transmission, interregional capability study, the ITCS. I'll say that a couple times. But really thinking about it at a high level, think about what's needed for the system as we're growing, as we're seeing more extreme conditions, the need to solve issues that can't be solved internally because of the resource mix options that we're constrained with, but also being able to integrate resources that want to come to market that might be distant from load. And so I think it's kind of important to maybe set the table a little bit and talk a little bit about why this is on our mind and why this has become more of a challenge in the past, especially in the past 10 years. So again, setting the table over the last 10 years across North America, we've really reduced the amount of capacity on the system when you look at peak. And that's kind of hard to grasp, right? We built so much solar, so much wind. How can the actual capacity go down? But of course, we've retired a lot of units. And when you look at that on peak capacity component, particularly during the winter, we've actually decreased the total amount of capacity on our system by about 4%. I'll go top left and then bottom left here. And then across the same period, last 10 years, we've increased demand. And of course, that's nothing in comparison to what we're seeing over the next 10 years, right? Over the next 10 years, bottom right, we're expecting a significant increase in demand, data centers, electrification, you've heard it. And so kind of no question why you've seen, I'm sure you all have read our long-term reliability assessments every year and have seen the map around the elevated risk profiles that we're seeing in more areas and more portions of the country. And so that kind of all gets down to the point that, every area, right, the way we were planned, the way we operate a system is an interconnected system, and we rely on our neighbors for support, especially during critical periods. But as everyone reduces the amount of resource or the amount of capacity they have on their system, we're more reliant on our neighbors, right? And that's going to be something that we expect to hold true in the future. Again, as we're bringing on resources that might be very distant, while at the same time being restricted on the types of generation that can be located internal areas, and also being able to interconnect the system to bring on those resources that we haven't seen that are, again, more distant from the load. And so there's a couple pretty good examples that kind of gets us into these tail events where, interregional transmission is really, really the one solution that we have that we know how to do that can really help. And so with this, with our wind group here and renewable group, I don't know if anyone knows what happened on June 6th of last year. Most people don't know, and that's because the system operated and performed as expected. But on June 6th of last year, if you look from the kind of bottom of Texas all the way to the top of Saskatchewan, that large swath of the country, there's about 60,000 megawatts of wind installed in that area. And on June 6th, it was outputting about 300 megawatts. I know we have some international folks, I don't know if any German, but the Germans have a word for this. It's called a Dunkelflaute, right? A kind of energy drought. I heard at the last session. And these are things that the Germans see, right? They got a lot of wind, a lot of solar, and it's something that we need to be prepared for. It's a part of our design criteria that we really need to be able to operate the system even when we don't have sun, right? We don't have wind. What are the resources we're going to rely on from our neighbors to maintain reliability? And of course, and I should mention, very different story, right? If that happened in July 6th or August 6th, right? When you didn't have enough excess generation from our neighbors and you're kind of limited in options. Similarly, in December of last year, I think we know Winter Storm Elliott, there were transmission constraints that limited the ability to share resources with their southern neighbors, and PJM ultimately had to curtail some resources. So it's clear that every area has gotten much tighter than they have been in the past. The assumptions about what they can rely on from their neighbors has greatly changed, right? It's always been, I've always been able to count on 1,000, 2,000 tie benefits from my neighbors, but those neighbors have changed over time. And when we see extreme conditions, we say they happen often, but they don't happen that often that we remember it all the time. But those changes actually change what we can count on from our neighbors. And so we were very happy to get a gift from Congress last year that actually ordered us to develop this study. I think it's pretty important. There's only two things Congress has asked NERC to do: form ourselves back in 2005, and then do this study, right? So on par with high levels of importance. And there's kind of three critical pieces to what Congress asks to do. One is total transfer capability, right? So calculate that. Pretty easy, pretty straightforward, very complicated. but something that we know how to do. NERC wrote the book on how to calculate transfer capability back in the 80s. So something that can be done relatively straightforward. The second piece was something new for us. We haven't ever seen prudent terminology in our engineering textbooks, but they asked us to identify and make recommendations around prudent increases to transfer capability that would strengthen reliability, right? So I think this is a really important word because it's not only about maintaining reliability, not just meeting resource adequacy criteria. This is really talking about those tail events where, it might be, beyond design basis in some cases when you looked at kind of normalized resource adequacy constraints and metrics. So identify recommendations for those prudent increases, and then make also some recommendations on how to meet and maintain those increased transfer capabilities. Probably the hardest part of all of this was kind of those first two words in the legislation, which was in consultation, right? In consultation with our stakeholders, with the registered entities. Almost anybody can, not saying it's simple, can kind of go in a smoke-filled room, go on their own, develop a study, knock it out. Here's what our results say. But what we did was kind of use the undercarriage of what we do every year, right? We're developing models with industry, validating those, building cases. And so we actually used industry's cases to develop the study, worked with industry, had an advisory group, making sure all the data is validated and kind of an acceptable way. And that just takes time. We've got 1,800 entities across the NERC profile. And so this is just that work that needs to be done when you look at a study that really hasn't ever been done. It's unprecedented at this magnitude and scale, but it's something new. It's something where we need to build and innovate towards. And I think we learned a whole lot in doing this, and really sets the stage on doing this more often in the future. I think Congress, at least intention, was a one and done, get this study out, but we just don't see it that way. We're going to continue doing it because it really was that important. We built capabilities to do that more periodically. Probably something that will show up in our future long-term assessment. So a couple key findings, observations from our initial study. Again, this is due out in about 30 days or so, so you should see it. If you haven't seen a draft of it, there's drafts available online. But I think one key thing, right? And let's remember the audience. The audience is larger than the technical audience. It's decision makers, policy makers, who might not really have a complete understanding of what transfer capability is. And the one thing I think we all know is it varies widely. It's not one constant number. When you look at the total import capability of every area that we evaluated, those range from between 1% and 92%, for instance, right? And it can change throughout the day as resources come in and come out. But what we looked at was a summer peak heavy load case and a winter peak heavy load case to give us just some guardrails around those, considering those are the times of year where we mostly need that transmission. The second piece is, transmission is not always the solution, but it certainly can be. The Congress mandates to look at transmission as the solution, but there's always kind of, I think, three legs of the stool that have to be considered. And I'm so glad Brian was able to kind of talk a little bit about that cost benefit analysis and the economic analysis that's needed to actually make decisions about which projects go forward. We don't look at any particular projects. We're looking at whole interfaces. But there are, three legs of the stool. You can build transmission to access resources that are distant. You can build internally, so long as the resources that you're building aren't subjected to the same type of common mode outage that is, that puts you in that place in the first place, right? So if it's a winter type condition and you have a lot of gas outage, building more gas plant in that area might not be actually helpful in solving the reliability challenges. And then, of course, demand, right? You can shift demand around, reduce the need for more interregional capability, perhaps new technologies, SMRs in the future, storage is a possibility. There's some interesting highlights from that. But there are many options when we highlight these energy risks. And what we're saying here with our prudent additions is, Congress asked for us, what would it take from a transmission solution perspective? So that's just that one leg of the stool. Resources can't be overlooked. The evaluation of those resources, again, it's not something that we commonly do. We're mostly planning systems from a regional or kind of transmission planning area perspective. But we got to start better understanding what our neighbor's resource profile is, so I can have a reasonable confidence that we're able to get those. Another thing was really important, the Canadian system. A lot of studies that are focused on the U.S., kind of U.S. policy oriented, what should we do as a U.S.? A lot of studies kind of mostly ignore Canada as a viable option for resources. So it was a really important part of the study that we looked at, and we'll have a Canadian version of the report that comes out in Q1 of next year. And then the last point, as we're really significantly increasing, pipes, the amount of transmission, large, transmission, that's going to require a significant amount of planning, system-wide reinforcements to really understand, what the implications are to the rest of the system, right? I think we all know increasing transmission transfer capability isn't as simple as stringing up wires, right? There's a whole lot of reinforcements that needed. And as they get large, we have to really understand, most severe single contingency type issues, stability concerns with such large transfers that are occurring. And the last point here is, this is really speaking to the decision makers and policymakers, but the transmission capabilities that we've recommended, likely won't be completed by 2034 unless there's some significant regulatory or statutory type changes, right? Just the amount of time it takes, the math doesn't math, right? With the amount that's needed and how long we actually see transmission takes. This is just a illustrative version of what our study looks like. You have the bubbles that looks at the energy availability within each area. So it's deficit, it's red. If it's in excess, you're green. That's kind of the energy part of the study. And then what we do is do the transfer capability part, identify recommendations for prudent additions, and where there are deficits, we look to their neighbors to see if there's excess at that right time and right place. And then if there is, we're able to recommend those prudent increases. I'll just quickly flash this. This is just import capability for a summer peak. You can see they're all over the place, ranging from 1% in Texas. I think we know that. But very high in other places, 92% in kind of the Northwest and others. And that's kind of understand that, right? The Western system's kind of built for that. Let's keep going. It's very clear here. I'm sure y'all can see it. But this is kind of the whole results of our part one. You can download this, but it really it's the first time it's ever been done at this scale. But you can really see the bidirectional import capability for each area, summer and winter, for all 90 some odd interfaces. This is just a quick illustration of how we do the energy assessment. Every one of those bubbles, this is kind of behind those bubbles, and we're identifying areas where there's a resource deficiency and highlighting that as a need. We do hourly forecasting, hourly modeling to take into account the daily loads. We got 12 weather years that are synchronized with load and resources. We're looking at wind and solar capacity factors, the daily thermal outage rates, and we're ultimately able to get to some energy margin level. Kind of take all that, keep going and give you some results here. So some areas, these are the energy deficits that were identified. They kind of range here. Most of the energy deficits are in that kind of 5,000, slightly less than 5,000 megawatt range. But a couple stand out. ERCOT, of course, mostly because of the weather year of Uri that kind of really drove a lot of the resource deficiencies. And then so when you get all those energy deficiencies realized, we can now start plotting, where those energy deficiencies, understanding where excess energy is, and you have the kind of color coded here, kind of stayed away from the green, yellow, red, mostly because green areas, most folks will look at that and say, oh, I don't need to do anything, my area is green. But the reality is there's a lot of resources in those areas that we actually still need, that are pending retirement, that are slated to be retired. So those resources, those areas really need to do a lot to make sure that they've got enough capacity on their system. And then some other areas, of course, need more generation. The other thing we looked at was there are certain interfaces that currently don't exist, but they're next to each other. So it's a possibility that those interfaces could be connected. A good classic example here is an ERCOT, where we're recommending increases to each of their neighbors. This is just in tabular form, available for y'all in the report. You can see it here, but you can really see each of the energy deficiencies, the cause of those deficiencies, the neighbors, and the amount of prudent recommendations. They total about 35,000 megawatts of capacity transfer capability increases across North America. And I'll just end with just one example. Every area kind of gets this kind of detail in the report. The CERC East example is an interesting one because there's a lot of storage actually in CERC East. And so one of the interesting kind of interactive effects that we identified was, in order to solve a 5,800 megawatt deficiency in the CERC East area, only 4,100 megawatts of prudent increases are needed. And that doesn't equal, right? So why is that? Well, you're able to utilize the storage more towards your peak, right? So you can forego using it early and use it really when you need it, and then that limits how much assistance from your neighbors. So some really good insights around how storage, demand response, all of these kind of things that we can move around can actually minimize the need for transfer capability. Okay, so that's it. Thank you so much. I'm over. Thank you, and happy to take any questions later. Thanks.
All right. Thanks, John, for teeing this up, and I'll try to piggyback on some of this work. I'm going to talk about some work we've been doing with ESIG over the past year or so, part of the Transmission Resilience Task Force. I'm standing up here, but Ryan Dio, my colleague, did a lot of this work. Want to make sure he gets some credit. There's also James Akulo and Josh Novichuk and Warren also very much involved in this. So want to give credit where credit's due. So what was the genesis around kind of interregional transmission for resilience? And I try to think about this in terms of two projects that ESIG's done over the past year. The ESIG criteria task for report that really talked about how do we move beyond single point expected value metrics for our 1 day in 10 loss of load expectation, and what might we want for the future in the way we plan our resource adequacy. The second was this interregional transmission resilience, looking at very much what John just described. When one region is in a deficit, how can we look at what's happening in the neighboring regions in a time correlated manner, understanding the weather patterns as they move across the system, and really bringing this interregional focus to resilience and resource adequacy, specifically during some of these events. So I really tried to combine these two. And when you put these together, I think it really brings out this new approach to what I call stress testing. And it's something that I think we need to add to some of the resource adequacy assessment. I think it kind of dovetails well with the end of that first presentation of how we can take these stress periods and really use those to identify what the system needs. So how do we do that? We come up with this wide area assessment where we're looking at across every region in North America. We look at available wind and solar, our seasonal hydro capability, the available thermal, which varies chronologically, just like everything else, depending on the weather. So we have weather dependent outages, fuel supply disruption on that fleet, expected maintenance and things like that. We schedule our storage resources, demand response, energy, limited resources. And then we want to calculate on every region what the hourly energy margin is. And the reason we go through this process is it allows us to look at the entire North American system without necessarily doing a really detailed probabilistic RA analysis of all of North America, right? Because that's going to be computationally challenging. So we come up with this hourly energy margin approach. It essentially approximates what that probabilistic RA study would do. So we put that together. John highlighted something very similar, but it kind of walks through. This is showing geographically those drivers. So starting in the top left, we have load. So the darker regions are regions that have high load relative to their seasonal demand forecast. So dark blue means that region is at its peak, or in all likelihood, well past its P50 peak, right? It's in its higher than expected peak load condition. Top right is the wind and solar. So actually in this, the dark periods are, or the dark regions are areas that have low wind and solar relative to their installed capacity. So everything's shaded here where the darker region is more risk, right? Bottom left is daily thermal outage rate. And this is from a summer event. This is July 17th, 2012. So it's a heat wave example that's kind of hitting the Great Plains during this point. So we don't see much correlation across the thermal outage rate. But if we showed this for a winter event, you would see these pockets where outage rates are much higher due to the cold weather outages and fuel supply disruption. And we bring all of that together and you can see this minimum margin. So as a percentage of load, we're seeing regions that are now below, unable to serve load. So the dark regions, unable to serve load locally with their own resources, and they're relying on neighbors for imports. And so this is showing that geographically across the whole country, and we actually have Canada included as well. Just simplified the chart. And this is for one point in time. Now we replicate this every hour across 12 weather years, and we're getting this full 100,000 hours plus of what resource availability looks like for each region and the transfer capability between them and how we might see some of these reliability flows. So what do we do with that? This is showing a correlation matrix, a lot on one screen, but on the left, we're showing the correlation of that energy margin across all 100,000 hours of the year. So darker combinations, you'll see that's where a region is highly correlated in its risk relative to its neighbors. So that means the region is hitting tight margin at the exact same time its immediate neighbor is. We actually don't care about that chart, right? Because that's looking at all 100,000 hours of the year. What we care about is this chart on the right, which is if I look at just the lowest, can't do the math in my head, 1 or 2% of hours across the entire year. Well, I want to look for one region when it's at its lowest energy margins, its highest risk period. What do the margins look like in all of its neighbors? Who has the most to share? And that's really what drives kind of, if we want to use interregional transmission for reliability, resource adequacy, resilience, that's the regions we want to reach out to, the ones that have the less correlation of this risk metric. Now, I talked about how we can combine this with the resource adequacy criteria report. And so this is when in the ESIG RA criteria report, there's 3 main recommendations that came out of that. One was to transition to a multi-metric criteria. 2 is to specifically consider extreme events. And the 3rd was to incorporate economics. I'm going to focus solely on that middle one. Like, why do we have to think about specifically considering extreme events? And so when you think of resource adequacy analysis, that's done probabilistically across hundreds or thousands of samples, maybe dozens of weather years. And what comes out of that is these kind of single point estimates of, hey, our loss of load expectation was 1 day in 10 years, or it's 2 days in 10 years, or we get an expected unserved energy. And those metrics are great. We want to continue to use those, but I think we need to drill in further into some of these extremes and understand why they're happening, what the key drivers are, and what we want to do for mitigations. So this is kind of a two-pronged approach. This is from some work we've done with Grid Lab that really articulates and ultimately made its way into some of the ESIG reporting that really articulates this two-pronged approach for resource adequacy or resilience, where we still have to continue doing that probabilistic assessment, but we want to also tie in what I'm calling stress testing. Some call this resilience, some call it stress testing, but really I think there's a key to look at some of these specific events. And why is that? There's a few reasons. One is we're kind of kidding ourselves that we can assign a probability to some of these weather events. We don't have the weather data. We don't have a long enough historical record. And then on top of that, the climate is changing, the weather is changing. So while we put those drivers in our probabilistic RA assessments, we can't actually assign a probability. So that's the first. The second is the mitigations that can solve it. I think we need to look a little bit broader. So while the probabilistic RA assessment is really looking at, do we have enough resources? The stress testing, you might start saying, okay, what can winterization do for me? What can, transmission upgrades or and things of that nature do? So that's part of the reason doing stress testing. The other piece is just a analytical perspective of whenever you're running thousands of years of simulations and getting millions of data points and consolidating that down to an average, even if you had the capability to look into any particular period, the reality is we don't. Like the folks out there that are doing resource adequacy planning, you get the number at the end and rarely do you like drill into a specific time period. So I think we need to do this stress testing. We need to understand what the drivers are that are causing that risk. And then lastly, I think there's this, in the past, we looked at resource adequacy of, hey, what happens when all of these random factors come together and we have lost load, and we've designed the system to say, okay, it's really prohibitively expensive to get rid of all of that random risk. And so we're going to live with some amount of it. We're going to live with 1 day in 10, for example. I think it's a very different story if we're designing a system and we say, we're planning the system, but we said we're not going to plan for that time when 300 megawatts out of 60 gigawatts of wind was available. We're not going to plan for it because it was rare. Like it only showed up once in our 40 years. I think we're going to get some pushback from customers that say, wait, you designed a system that you knew couldn't withstand a specific event. And when we look in the historical record, we see even in those RA analysis, sometimes we'll see cases where it's 1 day in 10 years, but it turns out 3 days out of 40 years of data drove all the resource adequacy risk. So at the end of the day, it is these extreme conditions that are causing the risk. And I think we need to drill into those further. So I think the worry that I have around the stress testing approach, and I've seen folks do this, and I get a little bit worried of where this could go. And frankly, it could go to gold plating the system if we say, let's make sure it's resilient against everything. So how do we balance that? I think the first is oftentimes I'll see people do this assessment and say, we want to evaluate this extreme outlier event, but we're going to do so without even considering our neighbors. So we want to look at that really cold snap and ignore anybody else because we can't rely on them. Also, people say they kind of come up with these artificially conservative assumptions around wind and solar, and they come up with a doomsday scenario. So they might look at the data from that day where there's 300 megawatts of wind out of 60,000 and say, that's why we can't rely on wind. And so we're going to run a scenario that has no wind or solar. Well, it turns out, I bet if you looked at that same day, there's probably a lot of solar going on, right? And we need to like look at how we come up with these scenarios that are credible, but show risk. And there's kind of a few other things, but we wanted to apply this to a SPP case study. And this really, the reason for this was twofold. One was to really bring this into a planning process and get a little bit more specific about a region. But another one was to really inform how we take some of these wide area assessments, like the work that John was showing that said, here's the entire North American system. And then how do we take that framework, but apply it to a regional planning study? Like I think John and anybody else that's doing these wide area assessments will be the first to say those are not meant to replace local or regional planning, right? They're used to inform it. So how do we use that type of work, the wide area work, and then insert it into a regional planning model? And oftentimes you'll see folks like SPP or MISO, they will model their system in a high degree of fidelity and then make approximations or basically say, we're going to assume no more than 4,000 megawatts is available from the neighbors. And how can we kind of marry the best of both worlds? And so what we tried to do here is do really in-depth modeling of the SPP footprint, but bring in that energy margin assessment from all of the neighbors. So we could say, well, when we're evaluating SPP's stress conditions, what are all of the neighbors? What do they look like? And SPP has this really is a great case study for this because one, it has a lot of neighbors, right? And it's spanning a lot of different geography and a lot of different weather zones. So to do that, we looked at 3 stress tests. One was an extreme cold event, Winter Storm Uri in 2021. The other was an extreme heat event in 2011. And each of these we looked at for a 2-week period. And another one was a wind drought that was very comparable to the one that John referenced. So we took those each for 2-week periods and we ran them through 50 stress samples. So we said, let's look at them with different combinations of thermal forced outages, renewable generation, maintenance, and transfer capabilities from outside, and then also different load levels. And the key thing here is we took those stress tests, those deterministic stress tests, and we brought in some variability around that, but we made sure to preserve what was happening in all of the neighboring regions. So when we sampled like different levels of renewables, we did that in a consistent manner that preserved the geographic correlation with all of its neighbors. So what does that look like here? You can see the distribution of our temperature on the bottom left, our wind output in the middle, and the gas fleet outage on the bottom right. And it's kind of those tails that we're concerned about. So in each of those extreme cold, heat, and drought events, we're saying, well, what happens if we start also hitting the tails on some of those distributions? And this is, when you pull all of that together, this is an example of the 2-week stress period. So this is the 2011 heat event. I believe this is the worst or second worst heat event that we saw for the SPP footprint over the period we were looking at. And you can see that black line, that's our average, or the kind of the deterministic sample. And then you can see this variation of those 50 samples kind of up above and below it, and it's tracking our energy margin across the full 2-week period. So when we look at a probabilistic resource adequacy assessment, all you'll see, it just counts like the number of times that that line drops below 0. But what this gives us is a more informed, like, okay, what's the energy margin look like across a wider range? And then we can also look at the bottom chart, which is showing the imports from neighboring regions. And again, this is the imports from neighboring regions, assuming the same weather conditions are happening in its neighbors. And so you can see the dotted line there, that's what SPP assumes as external assistance in their resource adequacy model. And you can see most of the time, like on average, the model is actually drawing much less than that. You'll see these times that go much further. And when we think about transmission for resilience, we want to look at these periods in particular and say, what's the availability of resources on the other end of that line? When we do rely on the resource, how often do we rely on it? And then relative to other resources that are facing similar challenges in the footprint, how does transmission compare to that? So a lot, I would say this work is in progress. We have a little bit more to do to finalize the stress test conditions and really evaluate those interregional transmission options and quantify the availability of those external resources and compare it to in-region resources. We want to consider future systems, so apply this to a higher renewable, higher electrified scenario. And then hopefully where we can get to in maybe a part 3 is understand the transfer analysis during those extreme conditions. So the work John was showing that kind of talks about the transfer analysis between one region and another. Typically that's done on like our standard summer and winter peak. We want to look at during these specific stress conditions, does that transfer capability change significantly? All right, thank you very much.
All right.
last presentation. You guys get to ask questions. Kris Zadlo, work for Grid United. We're an independent transmission developer. So I have an opportunity here to present maybe a case study on interregional planning. And maybe I'll start off by disagreeing with John. We view transmission as always the solution. So I want to present a really exciting project. It's our North Plains connector. It's a line that goes 415 miles. It starts in Montana at Colstrip and goes east and interconnects into the Mid-Continent ISO and the Southwest Power Pool. So both MISO and SPP on the east and WECC on the west. And this year, earlier in the spring, the Montana Department of Commerce received a $700 million grant from the Department of Energy to help facilitate the development of this line. We're making great progress on the line. I mentioned it's 415 miles. We've already acquired 95% of the right-of-way, and we're moving forward with permitting. But I'm going to stay on this slide for a second here because, and I wish I had a different map, because what's missing here is what's on both sides. And if you look on the Montana side, out of Colstrip, there's two 500 kV lines that go into the Pacific Northwest, right? And then on the eastern side, you have this 345 kV mesh that goes into the Midwest. So when you look at North Plains Connector, you need to think about moving power from the Great Lakes all the way to the Pacific Northwest. And when you think about that, think about how great that is. And think about for a second when you think about weather. When you think about weather in Seattle, do you think that's the same weather they're having in Duluth, Minnesota? Right? Probably not. So it kind of shows the potential of the meteorological diversity that this line can bring together. The problem with valuing interregional lines is there's all sorts of value streams, right? You got resiliency, reliability, you got economics, and how do you value each one of these value propositions? But for this presentation, we're just going to focus on loss of load expectancy. So going back to the weather, right? And when regions peak. And on this slide, what I'm doing is highlighting the three regions that the line actually interconnects. Okay, so when you look at the Pacific Northwest peaking, what's happening in the other regions in the United States? What's happening? That didn't sound good. So when the Pacific Northwest is peaking, what's happening in SPP and MISO? And you could see that they're approximately 80% of their peaks. Similarly, when you look at SPP peaking, what's happening in the Pacific Northwest, where they're only about 87% of their peak. Same thing, MISO. When MISO is peaking, the Pacific Northwest is at 84%. So again, this is from the DOE National Transmission Planning Study and shows that the load is not coincident in these regions. So that's one metric into a loss of load expectancy. But the other metric is nowadays, all of our regions are dependent on variable generation, and variable generation is also dependent on the weather. So this is just a snippet of what was going on with wind in the Pacific Northwest for a specific day in 2022. And the blue line is wind production in the Pacific Northwest compared to wind production in SPP and MISO. And what you're seeing here is the wind resources aren't correlated. Not a shocker, but it's supported by empirical data that the weather in the Pacific Northwest is not correlated with the weather in the Midwest. So then what we did was we hired Astrape Consulting to perform a loss of load expectancy analysis. And this is kind of the pipe and bubble diagram. And what's interesting is in their pipe and bubble base case, they didn't even have connections between MISO and WECC. So they had to create some new connections. And what we did is we asked Astrape to perform a study before and after, perform a loss of load expectancy study for the region without the line and then with the line. This is showing where MISO is its greatest need for capacity. And no shocker, it tends to be in the summer months, hours, 6 in the afternoon when you're getting those huge summer peaks. And then similarly, the Pacific Northwest right now is predominantly a winter peaking system, and that's where they're seeing their primary needs. So this is kind of leading up to the results, and you look at the results that are post and pre, and they're phenomenal, right? They go from 0.1 to 0.02. That's huge, right? 5x. That's a tremendous difference. The problem is I have no idea what these numbers mean. But it's important, right? They're important. I mean, how do you translate it, right? So I asked my team, like, guys, you got to make this, we got to translate this into something people can understand, right? So the team went back, and what they did was they went into the base case and started inputting perfect generation, right? To see that, okay, if the systems were still disconnected, in order to see that same decrease in loss of load expectancy, how much generation would you have to add to the system in order to achieve that same reduction, right? Well, I understand this. I understand megawatts, right? So the impact of the interregional line is the West is seeing almost 1,800 megawatts of capacity, and the East is seeing 1,750 megawatts of additional capacity just from this interregional line. And it's pretty amazing. It's pretty amazing because the line is only 3,000 megawatts. And when you add the two together, that's more than 3 gigs, right? But it's consistent with a previous, I think, a DOE study or NREL study that showed what happens when you connect MISO South and MISO North. The other amazing thing here is this value is understated because this is perfect capacity, right? And generation has a forced outage rate of 5%, right? So this actually, this value is more than that. But for us in the United States, this is a huge paradigm shift. How can transmission lines have capacity associated with it? That's kind of heretical almost. But that's what's done in Europe. We call our lines interregional lines, they call them interconnectors. And when they build their interconnectors, they actually assign a capacity value to it, right? And maybe this is a paradigm shift for us, that instead of having to point to a resource, but if you point to an interregional line with a lot of meteorological diversity, someone should be getting credit for that capacity diversity. The other interesting thing, and I'll just, snippets out of the DOE study shows that there's a tremendous difference in transmission expansion when you optimize just by region perspective versus all the regions together, right? If you start optimizing across regions, then you see the need for more interregional transmission having to be built. So this kind of leads me to my last couple of slides and points here is the ISOs do a poor job. Some of them do a good job. Some of them do a poor job of crediting interregional flows. So I think the ISO that does it the best is probably New York. They assign value on their interregional lines that in times of stress, there's an opportunity to be importing. Other regions don't assign hardly any value to their interties. And why that is important is if you don't subscribe any value of to your intertie flows, then it's really hard to justify interregional transmission lines. So, the status quo as far as resource adequacy goes on interregional lines tends to be backward looking. We look at what's been historically done. But if you do that approach, then you would come up with a zero value for North Plains Connector because North Plains Connector is a future project, right? So there needs to be some sort of mechanism to proactively accreditate new lines in order to help facilitate their development. That is my last